Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the Newsmaker Plenary at the NABJ National Convention and Career Fair. Please be advised, this event will be recorded and streamed for local, regional, and national audiences via social media and other web and broadcast platforms. Now, please welcome to the stage NABJ President Sarah Glover.
Good morning, NABJ. All right. Welcome to day 2 of the 2019 NABJ Convention and Career Fair, an annual gathering of working journalists, students, and media professionals. This is our opportunity to network, learn, advocate, all on behalf of Black journalists around the world. This morning, we put the spotlight on conversations dominating our industry. It's political season, so we have convened some of the best journalists in the business covering this arena to give us some insights on the election. Who are these candidates? What are the storylines? What does this mean for America, specifically African Americans and Black people? And let's walk away with a better understanding about this election. The Me Too movement is alive and well. We are seeing the impact of women everywhere, from Hollywood to City Hall in Chicago to Congress in Washington. Women are being heard and making progress in every industry. We can see the change that is having on America. How do we maintain this momentum and success? We will explore this question this morning. Let us also take a moment of silence to recognize the hard work of Toni Morrison, a true dynamic woman and messenger we lost this week, because she will be sorely missed. Black Americans are very active on social media, but the technology gap continues to widen between Blacks and other Americans. And so why is this happening in 2019? What are we doing to address this disparity? NABJ family and friends, we are in a very important mission. Our work is so vital to progress in America. Let's be inspired to return to our newsrooms, to fight the power, to deliver more fair, accurate, and in-depth coverage about Black Americans and from a Black perspective. Thank you for joining us this morning and for attending our NABJ convention. A special thank you to all of our sponsors, moderators, and panelists for helping to put the spotlight on all of these issues. Have a great convention.
We are going to keep on working, we are going to keep on fighting, and we are going to keep on winning, winning, winning.
Do you feel at a disadvantage as a white man? As a privileged white man, they say about you.
I don't feel at a disadvantage, and at the same time, I feel extraordinarily grateful.
There are a lot of people who feel that we don't need another white man in the White House.
All I can do is try to tell them that I will represent every one of them, whether they voted for me or not.
The reason why I'm running is because I'm living the American dream my immigrant parents came to this country for.
I got into this field because I think ultimately we're at a pretty dangerous point in our 243-year experiment called representative democracy.
Do you have a likability problem?
Folks had to like me to have made me mayor of New York City twice.
I know that as president, I can bring this country together.
I've served as a soldier for over 16 years.
I served 4 tours in Iraq.
And I have more military experience than anybody who's arrived behind that desk since George H.W. Bush.
And on day 1, we will rejoin the International Climate Agreement.
I can talk about the kids that I knew growing up whose lives are ended by gun violence. And so I'm running for president for many reasons. This is one, that we will get it done.
We're not trying to diminish the Second Amendment, but we've got to make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people.
You're going to get jobs in these communities, boosting their tax revenue that they can then reinvest back into the community.
Create the middle class.
It's going to take this effort. This is why I get so upset the president is so lazy.
They need us to restore economic mobility.
Best way we can empower African American businesses to put money into the hands of African Americans.
That's real. The best way to empower African American businesses, put money in the hands of African Americans.
I believe in a democratic socialism that works for the working families of this country.
Virtually everything many of the candidates are suggesting I've accomplished in my state.
I got a lot of plans, so let me just mention a few.
Do you have a plan to deal with Mitch McConnell?
I do.
I'll tell you one thing. It's really nice if we got all these plans, but if you think we're going to beat Donald Trump by just having all these plans, you got another thing coming.
I've long believed that this country should address slavery, the original sin of slavery, including by looking at reparations.
You know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools, and she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
Mr. President, this is America. And we are strong and great because of this diversity, Mr. President. Not in spite of it, Mr. President.
Please welcome your first moderator of the morning, CNN White House correspondent, Abby Phillip.
Hi, everyone. Let's see if this microphone works. Hello. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first session, the Newsmaker Plenary session. This will be divided into 3 separate conversations, starting off with the dominant conversation of this year and next year, politics. We want to welcome our panel, Ested Herndon from the New York Times, Eva McKen from Spectrum News, and Darlene Superville from the Associated Press. We're going to take some questions at the end of this, so think about them now. And I'll make a call and you guys can line up at the microphones, but let's get started. Oh, and for those of you who are wondering, Yamiche Alcindor could not join us this morning, unfortunately. We had some flight issues coming out of DC to New York today, so unfortunately. But let's give her a hand, we miss her today. So let's just start off with this week. Obviously, it's been a harrowing week, I think, for politics, for race in politics after guns and race in El Paso, that mass shooting in Ohio. But we've been here before, it feels like it, right? So, does anyone have a sense that this moment feels different to you? Do you feel like anything will change around the gun issue, especially since it's happening just on the cusp of the presidential cycle?
Well, thank you all for having us. I think that you're right that this feels like a kind of heavy week and moment. But onto the question of is this different, I don't see much evidence so far that we can expect some legislative differences coming forward. I think what there is, right, is this kind of looming election where you'll see Democratic candidates trying to use this as a kind of galvanizing message, not only for their individual campaigns, but to talk about things like flipping the Senate and the House. And I can expect that to go forward, but we've seen some states act, right? Like Florida is one that passed some gun safety legislation after Parkland. But is that going to change the kind of congressional landscape? I mean, I would defer to folks who are in Washington, but I don't see much evidence that we should expect to change that.
And Eva, you cover Mitch McConnell pretty closely. He controls the Senate. What do you think? I mean, will he let anything through the Senate? Universal background checks, even these red flag laws. What do you see?
It depends on where the president is. I think that we didn't, in terms of criminal justice reform, that for a long time, Senate Majority Leader said he wasn't going to bring it to the Senate floor, but because he got pressure from the president and because he wants to remain in good standing with the president is very popular in the state of Kentucky. He is moving where the president is moving. So I would say if we're going to see anything happening in Congress or from McConnell, it totally depends on what Trump's going to do.
And to that point, in terms of McConnell waiting to see where the president is, one of the issues that Congress has always had with this president is that one day he's on one side of the issue and an hour later, a couple hours later, a couple days later, he'll change his mind or he'll pull back from something that he threw out as a solution to whatever the crisis of the day has been. So it's not guaranteed where he's going to land this time.
Darlene, so, the other part of this after Ohio and El Paso, but particularly El Paso, is what role does the president play in terms of the rhetoric, the anti-immigrant rhetoric, in terms of white supremacy? What about that moment? Do you think that we are at any kind of inflection point for whether or not the president will change his language, or whether voters should or will hold him accountable for his role in the state of affairs of this country?
I think it remains to be seen. You and I have seen the president over the course of the last 2.5 years or so, ever since he's taken office, come to these moments, then he's forced to come out and be somewhat presidential, like he was on Monday when he talked about legislation, unity, love, putting aside partisanship at this moment in time following these past 2 shootings. But then a day or 2 later, he was back on Twitter insulting members of Congress, elected officials, the mayor of Dayton, Ohio, where he just visited yesterday. I think there are some people that would like to see this moment be a moment where he kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, does a course correction, but I don't see it happening given his past patterns.
And it's not like he has pressure to do so from his base. People like the language. His supporters like that type of language, like the demonization of undocumented immigrants. So they think this idea of white supremacy is a myth. White nationalism, they think it's made up by Democrats and by the media. So he has, beyond a few days, and I don't even think a few days, we already see him returning to this very divisive rhetoric. I don't see a path forward for him reversing his tone.
So on a similar note, so, after the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton lost. I think a lot of people thought she would win. In a lot of newsrooms across the country, there was what you might call soul searching. People wondering, what did we miss? What did we miss about white America? And instead, you've talked a lot about covering white people in the same way that we cover black people and Hispanic people, covering white identity politics as its own type of politics. Do you think that newspapers are prepared to do that in a way that you think is appropriate this cycle? Where do you think we are in terms of understanding the appropriate context to put, white voters, black voters, and how they matter in electing the next president?
I mean, the short answer is, I don't know if we're ready and I don't know if we're there. I mean, I think that when we talk about these issues, it was always very frustrating to me that when we look at black voters, when we look at minority voters, we often write about how they are coming into politics with a kind of racial lens, right? That the identity informs, that the way that they look at the system and the way they vote in the system. And the thing that I was always kind of advocating for it to do at my previous newspaper at the Boston Globe and now at the New York Times is white people do that also, right? They are coming to the ballot box with that racial lens, and it informs the kind of way that they view the system. And Donald Trump, I would posit, is one of the biggest practitioners of identity politics, and not the biggest in America, right? And so I have found it very important this year to chronicle those stories and to do so in a way that owns the kind of overt racial angle. So going to Trump supporters and not letting us exist in these kind of race-neutral euphemisms, right? Oh, I like the way he talks. I like that he hits back. The kind of phrasing that you'll often hear that strips the context of race. But asking him, who is he hitting? Why do you like that? Who is he hitting back on? And I find that when you ask those questions, you get fairly explicit answers. They'll kind of tell you that they enjoy the demonization when it's targeted at a specific group, right? I often find that they intuitively understand and know that when the president is targeting minorities, that is something that they're enjoying, right? It's not just they're voting for him in spite of the rhetoric, but because of the rhetoric. And so I find that, like, when you ask those questions, the base understands a little more sometimes the media is willing them to give them credit for, and that is part of that kind of way they're coming to the ballot box, and a key point in understanding President Trump's political appeal.
But do you think that newsrooms are, I think sometimes you see on social media a lot of frustration that there's so much attention being paid to, whether it's the economically frustrated white voter. Have newsrooms hit the right balance of telling those stories, but also telling the stories of other parts of the electorate? I mean, are we in the right place on that?
I think newsrooms are still trying to figure it out, how to strike the right tone, how not to forget certain people that feel like they don't have a voice. And I very much feel like newsrooms don't really know what to do, right? The ascension of Donald Trump threw a lot of media organizations by surprise. And so now they're trying to go to parts of the country that they didn't previously tell stories, coal mines, farmers in the Midwest. But I think that in that effort, I have concern that there will be there are people of color that live in those areas too, and deserve to have their stories highlighted. So hopefully those things can happen simultaneously.
So Darlene, we were talking a little backstage about this, when President Trump is going to be really in re-election mode, and you covered other presidents before. How is this different? I mean, does it feel different to you, the re-election bid that he is mounting, and is he in re-election mode right now? Are we in the full swing of things for him?
I would say that we're not yet in the full swing of things. That probably will happen once the Democratic field narrows a little bit. We have a clearer sense of who his potential challengers may be. But I think people need to remember that Donald Trump has been running for re-election pretty much since the day he took office. He had filed papers within a day or two of Inauguration Day. And the entire presidency has just been completely different from the one I covered before, which was President Barack Obama. I mean, they're like night and day. One big difference is the tweeting and the Twitter feed that we're all constantly watching. Waking up at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, and the first thing you do is look at the president's Twitter feed to see who he insulted or what he said, that kind of thing. And there's just a constant churn of events, people being fired, people quitting, the president saying off-the-wall things that you and I are having to jump to and cover every minute of the day. So it's been like a 180.
Yeah. It has been interesting to see him focus on particular candidates, though. He did mention at his Cincinnati rally last week Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren by name. So I don't know if that means he's sort of in his mind narrowing the field already.
Well, he is paying attention. He does mention Joe Biden quite a bit. He has mentioned Elizabeth Warren, as we all know. He talked about Kamala Harris a couple of days ago. He's been talking about Pete Buttigieg sporadically. So he's paying attention and he's watching the candidates and assessing them. I mean, he even tweeted yesterday that he was watching Sleepy Joe Biden give his speech in Iowa and it was so boring.
Yeah. And Asad, you follow some of these candidates and you've seen quite a few of them on the trail. What is your sense of whether the Democratic field understands what they need to do to activate minority voters in 2020 and to do so in a way that actually gives them an advantage over Donald Trump, as opposed to simply activating Democratic base candidates and also activating the president's base as well?
Right. I mean, Democrats are living in kind of fear of the 2016 result, right? And there are people who take that lesson of Hillary Clinton's loss in a lot of different ways. There is the community that says that, okay, you have to go to the Midwest and claw back some of these white working class voters who flipped from Obama to Trump. And there's another community that says, no, the real question of Wisconsin was the depressed turnout in Milwaukee was in places like Detroit and Philadelphia who did not come out in the same way. You mostly hear Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, the minority candidates, that is their electability case. When they go to these places, they say, oh yeah, I do think the top priority is beating Donald Trump, but the way I create that coalition looks a lot more like Obama in 2012 2012 than the kind of typical thing we hear about pulling back the kind of diners that we have all read of Trump voters. Do we think that they have the type of investment and they are paying more attention to it? I think that's still unclear. I mean, in the primary, there's certainly been more rhetoric around race, racial wealth gap, reparations, all these things have been talking points. Are they investing and tailoring themselves to communities the way that motivates them around the same issues that we know Black voters care about, like everyone else, right? Are they tailoring that kind of healthcare message to Black communities? Are they tailoring the same type of economic-driven things, the college affordability crisis? Are they tailoring that? It still, to me, seems for most candidates like an afterthought rather than a foremost concern. That has to change if a Democrat thinks they're going to be able to wrest Trump voters away. I mean, the Trump base is united and energized, right? If a Democrat is going to beat that person, they have to motivate those communities, and that has to be the forefront and not the afterthought.
As a follow-up to that, is it a given that the Black candidates, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, will successfully win the vote of people of color in this country, Black voters in particular?
No, I mean,
and I mean, talk to me about that, because I think that there is this sort of political wisdom that the Black voters will vote for the Black candidates. But tell me about what you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's 100%. The person leading with Black voters right now is Joe Biden. Right. I mean, and by a large, large margin. And so that's not just a polling thing. I mean, I spend a lot of time in South Carolina, as we all know, is the place that Black voters will have the biggest say in this forefront of this primary. And the kind of affection for Joe Biden is not just about Obama proximity, but about a kind of pragmatic concern of he can beat Trump, and Trump is a moral emergency, which I want to get ended immediately. And so when you talk about Black voters in this election, it has to begin with Joe Biden and that kind of older Black voter set that is right now with him. If that wanes, it opens up room for a lot of candidates. Elizabeth Warren's been making inroads with millennials. Bernie Sanders has a pretty decent, diverse coalition among young people. Cory Booker and Kamala Harris have been building organizations for older folks. But the beginning question with Black voters in this primary is, will they stick with Joe Biden, or will that kind of pragmatic consideration fall back?
If Kamala Harris is the candidate, I can already see the Trump team weaponizing her background as a prosecutor to try to create a wedge among Black voters. It will happen. So, and we'll have to see what kind of response, if she is the candidate, what kind of response emerges in the Black community. But I can already see President Trump coming out and saying, I'm the one that passed the First Step Act, you're better off now, or I'm the one that signed the First Step Act into law, you're better off now. Senator Harris put you all in prison. So I'm totally prepared to see something like that if she's a nominee.
It does beg the question, how important, you talked about the pragmatism of Black voters, but when, on balance between a Donald Trump and a Kamala Harris, whose prosecutor background might make some voters uncomfortable. I mean, do we have a sense of how high that issue of her prosecutor background might be, or how high criminal justice reform might be on the list of priorities for Black voters?
I can't say that I do, but when you put those two together, right, there's that motivation among a lot of the Black voters to see Donald Trump be turned out of office. So do you weigh keeping him in office because maybe you don't like something that was in Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record? It's a balance, and people are going to have to figure out what is more important to them.
Yeah, Black voters are Democrats, and so you'll know, without question who the nominee is, you'll see Black voters in percentage numbers largely back the Democratic candidate. The question is motivation.
Right.
And the question is,
enthusiasm
and turnout. Will there be a candidate that creates the kind of turnout and motivation necessary for the Democrat to overcome what will be losses among white voters? I mean, white voters will vote for the Republican, right? And so can they have a turnout in the necessary electoral college places that offsets what will be white rural, white suburban turnout for Trump in these other places? That's the big question. And we don't know Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Joe Biden, all of them face that same motivation and turnout question.
Let's shift gears a little bit and look at our newsrooms, our respective newsrooms. Actually, I think on the stage we have quite a few different types of newsrooms represented here. And this election is, and I think this political moment feels more racially stark than any moment really in recent history. I mean, even more so in some ways than 2008. So I'm wondering, are your newsrooms comfortable with talking about race? Do you find it to be an easy thing to have these conversations, to have these discussions in your newsrooms at this moment in politics?
I don't think it's ever an easy conversation when the conversation is about race, but one thing I would say about AP is that, your point about this election year being more racially stark than any in recent memory is true. Just look at what the president has said and done in the past couple of weeks in terms of the squad, in terms of Elijah Cummings, and even the events in El Paso. But at AP, one of the things that we've done this year in terms of our campaign coverage is we have a reporter. Most people in this room may know Erin Haynes-Wack. She's been our longtime race and ethnicity reporter. She's now been moved over to politics, and she's covering politics through the racial lens, and just covering all these issues from the president to Pete Buttigieg, and the issues that he's having with the black community in terms of support there. Joe Biden, all the flack that he's been getting for the crime legislation years ago. So that's one thing that we are doing, and we are trying to have those conversations and reflect that in the coverage that we're doing this cycle.
And Eva, you, just to add a little context here, you asked Mitch McConnell about reparations.
I did.
Why did you ask that?
Well, it was the day before this historic hearing that hadn't happened in a decade. We're now having this conversation about reparations. It's hot on the campaign trail, and he is the leader of the Senate. So will there be similar conversations in the Senate since it's happening in the House? And I don't believe that he ever went on the record on where he stood on this issue. And
were people in your newsroom surprised that you went there? I mean, just given, you focus on the Kentucky delegation, so in some ways it's not. I mean, I don't know that they would think necessarily that was an issue that resonated locally. But what was the response like?
I think people were, by and large, happy I asked the question. I think that they weren't we all weren't anticipating the answer. He said, Obama was our reparation, among other, he said
Obama's
Olivia.
black.
I'm kidding, I'm teasing. He didn't say that exactly.
I mean,
but it was close.
Yeah, you're not far off.
But I think that he echoed the sentiment of a lot of white Americans. I think a lot of white Americans don't feel comfortable recognizing the ways in which institutional racism still affects our everyday lives. So I'm not. I think McConnell echoes the voice of a lot of people in terms of how our newsrooms cover race. I hope that we can get to a point where calling out something as racist isn't viewed as partisan. That it isn't, we aren't sort of contorting ourselves to try to figure out the both sides of racism. And unfortunately, I think that that will become sort of less of an issue as newsroom management becomes more and more diverse. But that is still a challenge, I think, in a lot of newsrooms, trying to both sides issues of racism that there are no both sides to.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely an ongoing challenge. I mean, clearly, right? We see continued mistakes among news organizations across the board on this. The pitch I try to make in our newsroom is that I'm not even asking you to kind of make a moral question. This is the political concern of the moment, right? Our journalistic duty requires us to look at race in a kind of fact-driven, clear-eyed way, and to report on it in the same way that we report on issues across the political spectrum. And so, I think that that Donald Trump has kind of shocked newsrooms into thinking about the issue. It's so overt, it's so on the forefront that they've had to go to places they thought they may not have gone before. But that is because historically they have ignored it. And I think what we can do is diversify, what we can do is continue to push on these issues. But what we do know is that come next year, this stuff is not going to go away. This is going to be the driving concern of the election. And if we don't mount up to that challenge, we'll be failing our audiences.
Well, we're going to get some questions. So for those of you who have some questions for our panelists, please line up at the microphones. There's one there, one there. If we have one, I'll wait 15 seconds and then we'll get going. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. I'm E.R. Ship from Baltimore now. It seems to me that one of our primary obligations is to educate our audiences. And so even when we acknowledge that there is some particular concern that white people in Rust Belt America have, I think part of our duty is to focus on those issues of feeling lost in a new global economy, for example. Those kinds of concerns are also concerns that black people would have, or Latinos would have. So in going at the issues, we ought to focus on the issues more broadly and not just privilege the concerns of white folks. And I think we can do that in almost every area that we cover. There are no particularly distinct issues of race or education or maybe even criminal justice that can't be looked at beyond a black focus or a white focus. We should look at the issues as broadly as possible. So part of I guess my question to you all is, how much leeway do you have in changing the focus of the storytelling so that it's not just black people are concerned about criminal justice, Rust Belt white people are concerned about the economy? I mean, we all have those concerns. How can we do that and not tie it to what a particular candidate is doing, but following our obligation to educate people?
That's a great question.
That's such a great point. I actually think viewer feedback really shifts, or I don't know if shifts, but has an impact on our coverage. Every time a viewer writes in specifically about a story, my management is forwarding me their comments. So I think that a driving factor in all of this will be viewers sort of pushing back against the narrative. Hey, how come every time we're talking about black issues, we're talking about criminal justice reform? I think if there's that challenge from the viewers, I think that has an impact.
But do newsroom leaders understand that black voters don't only care about criminal justice reform and whether A$AP Rocky is in or out of prison? Do they understand that when we're talking about black voters in the Midwest, we're talking about union voters? Mm-hmm. We're talking about people who are working in factories that don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean,
you know, I think newsroom leaders, frankly, don't. I mean, newsroom leaders share the same biases and concerns that white Americans do largely, often. And those problems oftentimes come with the erasure of black and brown concerns. I think that is a journalistic failure, right? When we talk about these points of not talking the kind of the larger concerns of black and brown voters, it is our duty to tell the kind of richness of those experiences, and that requires understanding the kind of larger concerns that these people come to the political scene with. So, I mean, when we go to Youngstown and write about white economic displacement, when Youngstown has a huge population of people of color, right? You can do that same story with people of color and infuse that story and actually make it more representative of what the community looks like, right? And so I do think that it is incumbent upon us, and when we write these, doing a union story in Michigan, that does not inherently have to mean a white union story in Michigan, right? And so I think that to make our stories true, to make our stories journalistically accurate, it requires understanding that diversity. And I agree with you that that's part of our charge and mission.
I just want to add one thing really quickly. We also, sometimes we have to be in the room to sort of, to have our managers go that route. You know, last year hemp was legalized in the Farm Bill, and there's a lot of focus on going to white hemp farmers, and I really pushed for us to go to black hemp farmers. They're trying to cash in on this to revitalize their farms too. We have a scant amount of black farms, just a fraction of the farmland owned in this country is owned by black Americans. And so sometimes it takes us to be in the room to force those conversations.
And quickly, race works in the opposite way, right? When we talk about race and criminal justice and all the concerns that are typically black and brown, we only go to black communities and don't force white politicians or white communities to answer those same questions. I think in the same way we think about economic issues and kind of understanding the black concerns on those, we need to be asking white people about race also.
I'm going to go to the young lady in green at the mic there. Yes, please, if you could just ask your question.
Let me just
and then
finally say, I think maybe NABJ maybe can take this as a role to produce something so that all newsrooms will have some kind of tip sheet on how to cover these issues.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I'll go over to the other.
Good morning, and thank you all. This has been a very informative discussion. My name is Cherry Gregg. I cover community affairs and social justice in Philadelphia. My question for you all is, most communities are not, especially in Philadelphia where you're dealing with low, middle, low-income individuals, they're not paying attention to a lot of the debates. They're struggling, they're trying to survive. What do you think the issues will be that cuts through to this electorate? Because if Philadelphia comes out, it can swing Pennsylvania, which is a key state for Democrats. So what do you think the issues will be that really resonate with communities, lower middle income communities that are very essential to getting the Democrats any stronghold in 2020?
I think one issue certainly is jobs and the economy. That's always a top issue when it comes to presidential elections and voting. I mean, people vote based on their pocketbooks, how they're doing financially, can they pay the bills, can they put food on the table. Just listen to all of the issues that Kamala Harris, for example, talks about in her campaign. Another issue right now is healthcare, fears about losing it, what the Trump administration wants to do in terms of repealing Obamacare, what would they replace it with, if anything. So those are two top issues that come to mind right away. But also, there's still a lot of time between now and when people go into the voting booth in November, and some of those issues could certainly change, and we don't have a crystal ball to know right now what those issues are going to be, but oftentimes it comes down to money.
Yeah, because I see that people sort of ignore all of this. And I always, do gut checks with just the regular mom with kids, single mom trying to raise a family. What are you paying attention to? And a lot of times they're not paying attention to what we're paying attention to. Yeah, so that's why I asked that question.
And a lot of times also, and especially in this current cycle, there are just so many candidates, right? So a lot of people may be taking the posture that, well, I'll wait for 20 to become 10 or to become 5, and then I'll start paying closer attention. Or they're probably waiting until it gets closer to whenever the primary is in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, when they actually have to sit down and try to make a decision.
It's incumbent on Democrats and the Democratic candidate to motivate those people, right? I think sometimes when we talk about when white voters don't turn out, we're like, oh, well, what did the candidate do wrong? And then when we talk about when people of color don't come out, it's their individual problem. I think it is still a structural question. It's still a question of how are the candidates motivating these communities and talking to them in a way that gets them excited. I mean, I think that the Trump administration, we know that the Trump administration is going to tell a story about a kind of macro level economy. Democrats are going to try to do the opposite, that has not helped you. If you are in Philadelphia, the story, or if you're talking to those communities, the story of the economy is working is not going to be one that looks true in your everyday life. And that's kind of an inverse of where Trump was in 2016, right? Hillary Clinton was telling that story about a general, let's continue this race. And he was saying, this isn't helping in your day-to-day life. Democrats are going to try to do that this time around. that's not working for you, income inequality, college affordability, and try to use those as issues that bring people who might have been sidelined into the center.
Let me go over here.
Hi, my name is Marcus Mabry. I'm from CNN. I want to start off by acknowledging E.R. Shipp, who asked the first question, who was a pioneering, Pulitzer Prize-winning, African-American, powerful female journalist, and thank you for being here. My question for the panel, and I hope it's not too esoteric, is we found at CNN, and I think in all of our news organizations, this is a particularly difficult administration to cover because it is so, let's say, untraditional, that our regular way of doing business doesn't necessarily serve our audiences. So in the old-fashioned, on the one hand, on the other hand, being objective, not calling a lie is a problem for us in journalism. And so our anchors, for instance, on CNN, much more commonly are saying the administration lied today than we ever have in our history, which makes some viewers think, oh, well, CNN is biased now, blah, blah, blah. This is a problem traditional journalism does not empower us to address. So I wonder if you, as people covering politics and covering the White House, if you've had these situations where it's been difficult to do your job as you were always trained to do it. And what are the ingenious solutions you came up with in order to still serve the public and history? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I also one story. I remember going to my first Trump rally, and I remember thinking in my head, like, all these people are doing this thing wrong. I'm going to show everyone how it's done, blah, 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 blah. And it's so hard. Like, when you go there, the kind of deluge of misinformation and untruths makes it very difficult to frame in a way that I think it sits well with any of us journalistically. It presents real challenges. I mean, I think that the traditional model we're talking about of the kind of both sidesism, of using the kind of assumption that a person is speaking in good faith is not a model that works for right now. We need to think of new ways to frame stories that can deal with the kind of what we know, which is that the last 3 years, this administration has said a lot of things that just aren't true, right? Like if Donald Trump was a source that we would use, we would never take that at face value anymore because he's been proven false so many times. We need to take that same lens into our coverage. Otherwise, we're gonna be embarrassed.
Right, I agree with that, and I was going to say pretty much the same thing, that now that we know that we have a president that oftentimes says things that aren't quite accurate, untrue, et cetera, and so on, when we are covering him, the stories always have to now, he said this, but here is what the reality is, here is what the statistics show. We have to kind of counter what he's saying in real time in our coverage in order to serve the readers, because, as I said, we know that a lot of what comes out of the president's mouth these days and from the administration is often skewed, and we have to be the ones to present the full picture to viewers, readers, listeners.
I think, just to add my 2 cents here, Marcus, I always in this administration start with the assumption that anything being said is not true until proven true. And I work backwards. And I think that that is actually not a bad thing. Yeah. It's not a bad rule to apply not just to Trump, but to pretty much everybody across the board, that if you do not know the thing that is said to be true, you need to take a minute, fact check it, and then report it. Because I think that we used to, in previous administrations, just a few years ago, anything a politician said was assumed to be generally true, that people were generally acting in good faith. Unfortunately, that is not always the case, and it's probably good for us as journalists to be a little bit more, turn the dial a little bit more to the skeptical side, and making sure that when we're conveying things to people, that we have a decent sense that it is either proven to be true or likely to be true. Because I think if we don't do that, we're doing a disservice to people. And then the counterpart to that is that when there are clear lies being told, you just call it for what it is. I mean, the other day, the president said that there were millions of people voting illegally in California.
The trust we lose when we don't call those things out. And so that's the thing that I am often considering is like, what happens when we don't do those things? I think that universe is actually worse than the ones who use the truth to be scared.
Thank you. It's inspiring to see you guys in the places you're in, and I hope that all of NABJ will realize that you are role models and pioneers and inspirations for their careers.
So much. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all for your attention, for your questions. We're going to introduce the next panel for their insight. Please stand by for the next part of the session and give everyone on the stage a round of applause.
The power we have as Black folks, particularly as Black women, the power of our voice and our story and our narrative, you know, we underestimate it because they want us to underestimate it, you know, but I'm here to tell you there is nothing we can't do or change when we as a collective put our minds to it.
After my son's death, I dedicated my life to advocating for common sense gun safety solutions, but it was the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, that year that finally motivated me to run for Congress.
I did not want this spotlight, but I will do everything I can to focus some of this light on the pain of a path out of the darkness.
They saw me run across the road, but I've been running for the people ever since, the people who've been left behind in prison.
Frustrated with all the sexual violence that I saw in my community, I pulled out a piece of paper and I wrote "Me Too" on the top of it.
Oh my goodness.
And I proceeded to write out an action plan for building a movement based on empathy between survivors that would help us feel like we can heal, that we weren't the sum total of the things that happened to us.
This is ridiculous.
Please welcome your second moderator of the morning, reporter for the Washington Post and former NABJ president, Vanessa Williams.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. For the next few minutes, we're going to focus on the power of Black women. Our beloved Toni Morrison, one of the most indelible voices of our time, passed away this week. And her passing is a reminder of the power and the importance of Black women raising their voices. And today we're going to continue the conversation about the power of Black women. And I'm going to introduce our panel now. Let me just remind everyone that in 2012, African American voters came out at a higher rate than any other group. That was fueled by the participation of Black women who voted, all right now, who voted at a higher rate than any group that turned out that year. So we're going to talk about that, and actually the first person I'm going to introduce is largely responsible for helping that happen. It's not just Black girl magic, it's Black women working hard. Melanie Campbell, who is the president and CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, and she's the convener of the Black Women's Roundtable. Thank you. A warrior in the courtroom, our sister Kristen Clark, who is president and CEO of the executive director, president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Our next guest, I'm sure we all know her, Sybrina Fulton, a mother of the movement, who the murder of her son, Trayvon Martin, in 2012 helped to amplify that movement. And we're pleased to have her with us today. She also is a candidate for the county commission in Dade County. So we'll look forward to hearing more about that. Sybrina, thank you for being with us. And last but not least, the issue of reproductive health is at the forefront of news these days, given the passage of anti-abortion laws across the country, particularly in Georgia and Alabama. So our next guest is a warrior on that front, Miss Monica Simpson. She's Executive Director of Sister Song, which fights for reproductive justice and which is the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of Georgia over its anti-abortion law. So welcome, Monica. So let's get started with this conversation. Melanie, your group, Black Women's Roundtable, which has chapters across the country, but especially in the southern part of the country, one of the more challenging, I would say, parts of the country when it comes to Black voter participation, and not because Black voters don't try, and we could talk a little bit about that. But what do you see as the challenges going into 2016 with regard to turnout? I mean, we have consistently seen Black people turn out, but what challenges do you see in 2020? I'm sorry, I said 2016.
Yeah, right,
2016, we had a bit of a dip. 2020, it's important. I believe people believe it's important for folks to come back. So what is the challenge and how do you get it going?
Thank you, Vanessa.
Sure.
And thank you, NABJ, for all you all do to tell our stories. I'm gonna start with the flip side. 2018 was a ray of hope. 2016, you're right, there was a dip. 2018, especially among young people turned out. One of those stories that's just definitely not been told enough is that young people turned out in 2018 in record numbers. You're talking about a 70% increase. So that was a plus. The challenge I see, and I know my sister here from the Lawyers Committee will go even deeper, but the challenge is the fact that we have a president in the White House who is stoking the idea of getting back in office the same way he got in office the first time, and that was through foreign meddling, that was through voter suppression, that was through a whole lot of things. None of that, not that there haven't been fights, there are fights in winning, but a systemic fix. We still have foreign meddling going on in this election, right? We still, and you also have a U.S. Senate that won't do what needs to be done to fix it. So we have the issue around making sure that people are armed with the power to fight back on that. To be able, we're going to have to turn out. We're going to have to be super voters to turn out, so that we can try to mitigate some of that. Because we're talking, this is what, August. We'll be voting. Most Black folks start voting in February. You know, we got a few folks in Iowa and all this, but so when we get to South Carolina, that's going to be the test, and so that's going to be really a challenge. I don't think it's going to be a lack of enthusiasm. Everybody I talk to, especially on the road, especially Black women, you know, we got to do what we need to do. I'm nonpartisan, so I'm not going to say who, but surely I think we're going to turn out. But we got to make sure that when we turn out and do all of that hard work that we know we're going to do, that vote gets counted.
Okay, Kristen, a lot of times when people think about a lot of the work that you do and the committee does is fighting voter suppression, voter irregularities, again, particularly but people think that's mostly just in the South or in states that had a history of disenfranchisement. Can you talk a little bit about your work, what you're doing, not just in the South, but all around the country, and also remind people that even in blue states, quote unquote, there are concerns and there are stories that need to be told about voting rights?
Sure. Thank you, Vanessa, and thanks to the National Association for Black Journalists for all the great work that you do. One thing that we should all be aware of going into the 2020 cycle is that voter suppression is alive and well. It is widespread and systemic. It's pervasive in urban areas and rural communities. It's everywhere. And it's something that we have to keep our eye on as we go into the next cycle. We got to think about one of the very first things that President Trump did when he took office was he launched a so-called Election Integrity Commission, which we successfully beat back in the courts. But the message that he sent out to officials all across the country was that this is the time to put in the groundwork for voter suppression measures. And there are officials right now who are heeding his call. One of the most egregious examples of voter suppression that we've seen so far in 2019 emerges out of Tennessee. Last year, Tennessee had one of the lowest voter turnout and participation rates in the country. In fact, that has been true throughout history. And through the work, hard work of organizations like the Equity Alliance and Black churches, they did something remarkable. They managed to get more than 95,000 mostly low-income, not yet registered African Americans onto the rolls. And what did lawmakers do this year? They reacted by putting a law on the books that would impose criminal penalties and fines on groups that are actively engaged in registering people to vote if they fail to meet low-level minutia requirements. This is all about chilling the vote and discouraging participation from people like us, from Black and brown people. So it's really important that we remain vigilant. We're fighting voter suppression in Georgia, where we're pushing for modernized machines with a paper trail. We're keeping our eye on Russia and the way that they continue to push out messages intended to promote racial discord. We're fighting voter suppression in New York City and Los Angeles. There is no community that is immune. So it's important that we turn out and participate, but it's also critical at the same time that we fight back when they aim to keep us silent and keep us locked out of our democracy.
Thank you. Sybrina, you're a candidate for the county commission. One thing I wanted to ask you about is young people. Melanie said they did come back in 2018, but they continue to sort of be among the most demanding voters, insisting that candidates focus on the issues and be authentic, if you will. So against that backdrop, how do you propose to run? What are you saying to reach those young people and to assure them that you're not just going to become part of a system and it'll be the same old, same old?
Well, one of the things I can certainly say is that I am real, and that's what the young folks want. They want somebody that's real. I'm not going to necessarily say what you want to hear, but I'm going to tell the truth. And I think that's a lot of, that was a lot of the issues that the young people had with the politicians that we have in place now. They're considered career politicians. I'm new, I'm a freshman at being a politician. And so I'm gonna turn over some rocks. There's gonna be some snakes under them rocks. It's gonna be some things that people take advantage of and say business as usual. There is no business as usual for me. I want to know so that I can give the information properly and correctly to the people. I call myself the people's politician. I'm fighting for the working class. I'm fighting for the seniors. I'm fighting for the young people. I was born and raised in that particular area in District 1. I also worked 24 years with Miami-Dade County, and I just feel like I'm going back to the environment that I used to work for. I feel like it's another level of service for me. I do run the Trayvon Martin Foundation, which I consider very successful. Of course, we can always use additional funds, but at the same time, we continue our programs year in and year out. We still give scholarships to high school students. We still have the Circle of Mothers, the Circle of Fathers. We have a Remembrance Weekend every year in February. We have a youth event where we bring about 1,200 young people together. And some of those are my favorite parts, is just talking to the young people about what they want to do in life, about what their dreams and aspirations are. And yes, we do have a lot of people that feel like, young people feel like that things are hopeless because of what they're seeing now. And a lot of times I apologize for that. I say, I'm sorry the way we're turning this world over to you. And I make no mistake about it, because I think when we're open and honest with things, that's the only way we can move forward.
Thank you. Monica, talk to us, I think is very interesting and important. This issue came up in one of the earlier debates about the difference between reproductive rights, quote unquote, and reproductive justice. I think that's an issue that needs to be surfaced. Tell us the difference and how we as journalists need to look at these issues.
For sure. Again, thank you all so much for having us on this panel here. The beautiful Black women I get to be on the panel with, I'm so excited. And I think it's really important for us to talk about reproductive justice and reproductive rights right now and really understanding the difference, because it is really like at the core of like what is really most important for folks right now. And historically what we've heard is like reproductive health and rights, and this has been the language of the pro-choice movement, folks who have been able to talk about access to abortion, access to contraception, and that has been a work and a movement, if you think about it from a media standpoint, that has really been led by large mainstream white-led organizations, right? And it's not that Black women have not always controlled our own fertility. It's not that we have not been on the forefront of these issues since the beginning of time. It's not that we haven't had to do this work alongside other movements, because our bodies and our lives and all that we fight for are all inextricably linked. But what reproductive justice did actually 25 years ago, right? 25 years ago in 1994, 12 Black women came together to talk about what it meant to talk about our reproductive health and rights in this country in connection with the very real social justice issues that are intertwined with our reproductive decision making and our ability to really live our reproductive lives in this country. And so they took a more intersectional approach. They took an approach that was rooted in human rights, and they created what we now know as reproductive justice. And one of the first things that they did at that time was to put a call out against Congress in 1994 at the height of healthcare reform. And so what we see with reproductive justice, and again, we see reproductive health rights and justice as an overarching kind of sector, right? But reproductive justice, again, takes a more intersectional approach, and it is a movement and a frame, right? So the movement is led by people of color all across this country, and the framework is intersectional and rooted in human rights and allows us to talk about the connections between economic justice, environmental justice, sexual assault, criminal justice, and all the different systems that intersect in our lives in connection to the reproductive health and rights decisions that we need to make every single day.
Melanie, your group is also very active in trying to prepare our communities to participate in the census next year. Tell us about that and why it's so important, and what stories are we missing perhaps or not paying attention to in this very important
The biggest I say challenge and opportunity as an organizer is that the census in 2020 will happen at the same time as the primaries. So that means we have to make sure we walk and chew gum at the same time. Mm-hmm. The reality is that the count for the census the first time will be online. Mm-hmm. So the reality that we have to have an online organizing strategy, especially for younger Black folks, to be able to use that tool if they choose to. So what we've been doing is pulling together, our Unity Diaspora Coalition, because the reality for Black folks, when we're talking about Black people getting counted, we have to work in coalition with all Black folks. That includes folks from the diaspora, folks from the African continent, folks from the Caribbean and the like. Mm-hmm. And so we've been pulling together to develop a kind of organizing and messaging to know that we have to make sure that we connect the two. They're both about power. It's really about power. It's about money and resources for our communities. So that's been our real focus, to be able to engage. The folks who don't get counted mostly are children. So that means we have to find ways to engage the parents, the mothers, the grandmas, the aunties, the folks, because a lot of times, you may have a grandma who's taking care, helping to take care, and say, well, I'm not going to put you on the form because you're not my child. I'm your grandchild. But the mother says, well, not putting on the form, and then no one gets counted. So children are like the main ones, and then Black men.
Yeah, I was going to ask you why Black men.
Really, I think the skepticism of it, and then the other would be Black immigrant populations who, when you hear people talk about the census, you hear people talk about the citizenship question that this current occupant has been pushing, although things have been pushed back. But a lot of the damage, what I hear from the leaders that I work with and organizers in the Black immigrant community especially, the fear of this is real, and a lot of the damage has been done. So being able to get those stories out about what the importance, and getting trusted messengers out there and trusted voices, and you guys be able to share those stories so folks can really connect those dots. so that when we go, and we've decided, when we're out here getting ready to do our get out the vote efforts, we're going to be pushing the census and the vote and really giving people the information that need. And then also working with our legal community to help make sure folks are fearful that their information will be used to impact them. There's intersectional components to that. But there's so many elements to why we don't participate. But at the end of the day, I'm like this. I want my money coming back to my community. If I got to fill out this form, you know, and I say this to you, how many of us got one of these, right? They follow this everywhere we go. So I don't even worry about it no more, right? The reality is, you know, you cut it off, you know, you can cut it off and throw the phone away and throw it in the beach. But unless you do that, they can follow you any way you want to do. So we have to kind of get past some of the fear, but respect the fact that people have legitimate reasons for being fearful. So it's a challenge, but we're gonna, you know what I mean? I'm always ready for the fight, so I'm ready for that. We're gonna do what we need to do to make sure we get counted and we vote.
All right, thank you. Kristen, an issue in the news the last couple of weeks having to do with the violence, the mass shootings, at least one of them, according to reporting, perhaps incited by inflammatory rhetoric and hate speech. The Lawyers Committee does some work in that area. Can you tell us about that? And let's try to, if we can, be a little succinct so we can have like the audience ask a couple of questions. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt the rise in white nationalism and white supremacy is something that we should all be deeply focused on. It is tearing apart the fabric of our nation. It is destroying lives. It's ripping communities apart. And it is a crisis that is fueled by the dangerous rhetoric that we have seen emanating from this White House every single day. But it is also a crisis that's fueled in part by a lot of activity online. We are seeing social media platforms that are being used and exploited to recruit new people to the movement, to fundraise to support these dangerous, violent movements, to broadcast their dangerous activities. And so a lot of the work that we're doing at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is about holding social media companies accountable for their failure to undertake the action that's necessary to confront the rise in white supremacy. They're no longer meeting at the corner shop and hiding under hoods. They are out emboldened and marching through our streets, and they are planning these activities online. And so right now it's really critical that we hold the Facebooks and the Twitters and the YouTubes accountable. Just yesterday we went after YouTube because there is a dangerous video that was linked to both the Christchurch and El Paso massacres, and that video needs to come down because it is one that is inciting racial violence. It is one that is leading to the death of Americans, and this is a crisis that all of us should be focused on front and center right now.
Quick follow-up. How do you balance that with the right to free speech, which as journalists, it guarantees our ability to do what we do?
The First Amendment is the bedrock principle of our democracy. But this is a crisis that's leading to death. This is a crisis where we're seeing people being assaulted in the streets. This is a crisis that can't be ignored. The First Amendment does not protect activity that leads to people inciting racial violence, and that's precisely the piece of the problem that we are focused on.
Thank you. Sybrina, likewise, the issue of gun control has come up in the last week with the mass shootings. What do you think we need to do as a society? What can we do to get government to take action? What examples can we learn from the children from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who did manage to get some reforms, some limited reforms in the Florida legislature? Where do we go? How do we attack this problem?
It just seems like society and government won't do anything unless you apply pressure. So I think the more pressure we apply, not just for our leaders that's in elected positions, but also the community. We have to hold the community responsible for applying pressure as well, because a lot of times a situation happens with a shooting and then it's on the news, people are talking about it, we're angry about it, and then guess what? We move to the next tragedy. And so we gotta stop moving to the next tragedy. We gotta stay on some things and really press the issue. And I think that is the problem. We gotta just apply more pressure. Right now is the best time ever just to make your voices be known. We can't afford to be quiet. It's a life or death situation. We can't afford to sit and not say anything. You can't afford to not use social media and not have like different discussions and things like that. You have to do something. Our life depends on it.
All right, and Monica, your organization has filed suit against the state of Georgia for its anti-abortion bill.
Yes.
Is that the best way to fight this movement across the country, or what else can people do?
We definitely think it's one very effective way to fight back, right? These abortion bans swept our country over this past legislative session, and they're absolutely absurd, and they are putting the most marginalized communities at risk. And what's powerful about the reproductive justice definition and frame is that we center abortion access because we know how incredibly important it is for our communities, while we also talk about the human right to have the children that we want in the ways that we want, and to be able to parent our children in healthy and safe environments, and have the overall human right to bodily autonomy. And what these bans have done has actually came right up against this very core principle of our work. And so, yes, we are suing Georgia. I say that with a smile on my face, because we refuse to go back to a day where we live in a country and we live in a state where our bodies and the decisions for our bodies are made on our behalf. That's a very scary time, and we're not interested in doing that. And so in Georgia and across this nation, we are fighting back in all of the ways, and being able to take these court cases, you know, where we need to go is what we have to do, because we know ultimately our opposition is also using all of their a myriad of ways to actually push forward. There's been over 400 abortion restrictions in this country over the past 4 to 5 years. Since 2010, there's also been a racialized stint on how folks are talking about abortion in this country, with billboards that came to Georgia that read the most dangerous place for an African-American child is in the mother's womb, and shaming Black women for having too many abortions. But in this country, we're not talking about the fact that we're only making 64 cents on the dollar, that we still have not come to any resolution around what we need to do around the sexual assault that's happening in this country. We live in a region where Medicaid expansion has not happened, so thousands of people are falling in the gap. Yet and still we have these bans that are pushing away access and moving people further away from what they need to be able to sustain themselves and to take care of themselves and their families. So we are going hard in Georgia. Our collective resistance is strong. Our collective resistance is strong across this country with reproductive justice, and it is being led by Black women, y'all. I need y'all to understand that as journalists, that we really need you all to help amplify the leadership of Black women doing this work, and how we are talking about this issue in a way that is expansive and brings more people to the conversation.
Very good. Yes, please. Thanks. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. I would ask each of you all to briefly, quickly, what stories are we missing? Give us like a good story idea that we could pursue. Keep in mind that some of our members, many of our members work in local markets, that you don't need to be a national reporter in order to raise up these issues. So Melanie, what stories are we missing? What would you like to see more?
I'm going to pick up back here. Tell the stories of Black women who are not just, we're not just voters, right? We are that, yes. We lead the Black vote, but we're out here doing the work. We have so many organizers on the ground that are doing the work. So tell our stories. Share our research. We make sure that through the Black Women's Roundtable, we do research that comes from a Black women's perspective, focusing on the issues that are important to us. So just really just continue, amplify those stories, because that's what's going to really make a big difference for the work that we do every day, and trying to make sure that we lift up Black folks, especially my organization, and as it focuses around maximizing the power of our vote, the power of our leadership and organizing as well.
So we talk a lot about the White House. We talk a lot about a broken Congress. We don't talk enough about what's happening to our courts. And let me just say that President Trump has made it his highest priority to transform our federal courts, and he is doing so at lightning speed. Today, about 1 in every 4 federal judges is a Trump appointee. And these are nominees who are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male, and their views are radical, extreme, and far outside the mainstream. And these are people who are young and who will be there for decades to come, and will most certainly have a lasting legacy on the way that justice gets rendered in our country. So we need to be talking more about this because it's a crisis. Over 144 judges appointed to lifetime seats in the first 2.5 years of President Trump's tenure. Nominees, many of whom are unwilling to say that Brown versus Board of Education was rightly decided. The seminal Supreme Court case that said that desegregation is unconstitutional. We have to keep our eye on this issue. The courts have been an important place for rendering justice for Black people throughout our country. And at the rate we're going, I'm very frightened about where we end up. We need to be speaking out to our senators. We need to be calling them and putting pressure on them to slow down, unpack the dangerous record of these nominees. And we need to be sounding an alarm about not one single Black woman has been put on the courts under President Trump, not a single Black woman. The way that we're turning the clock back on race and gender diversity is something that we should all be sounding an alarm about.
Thank you. Sybrina.
I'm going to say continue with the times. A lot of times people don't want to use social media. We need to use social media more. We need to, when our Black reporters report something and it's something that we support, we need to make sure that we're retweeting, we make sure that we're posting so people know that we're supporting these people, because a lot of times the part that we don't see is those people might have death threats because of what they said. And so a lot of times it's power in numbers. And so we got to make sure that when Mr. Lewis posts something, when Reverend Sharpton, even when Jesse Jackson, when Joy Reid, like those people support, post something, that we're supporting them. I watched Don Lemon last night. He was so passionate about what he said. You know, he almost had me in tears because he was so passionate that this didn't start, and we know it didn't start with Donald Trump, but it's just so prevalent of what's going on. It's really opening a lot of people's eyes again to what's going on, to let us see that this is a crisis. This is a serious issue, and we can't afford to be quiet. You have to post, you have to say something, you have to support the people that are saying the things that you are in support of.
Yeah.
Thank you. Monica, last word.
Absolutely. Two things. One, reproductive justice has been a movement and a frame that has always worked at the intersections. We need journalists to be writing at the intersections. So as we are talking about these issues, we need to see y'all, and we want to bring you all deeper into these issues. When we talk about maternal mortality, how do we talk about that in connection to economic justice, in connection to reproductive health and rights, in connection to, you know, what is happening environmentally or the toxins? I mean, we need to be talking about it all together. So I think that that's one thing that I would want to really amplify, is that we need you all to be talking at the intersections with us. How do we also connect sexual assault and all of that directly to our work of reproductive justice? Those intersections are important. Secondly, we got to talk about sex, good people. Let me tell you, the reason these particular conversations around abortion access and all of these things continue to be wedge issues, continue to be the very thing that divides us in so many ways, even though we know that people, when we look at the polls, we look at the data, that folks feel like we should be able to make our own decisions, but they are using this against us, in particular the Black community. So we need more journalists willing to talk about sex, willing to talk about bodies, willing to center that conversation. And you all can do that by coming to our conference in October in Atlanta, Georgia, which is the Let's Talk About Sex conference, which centers these types of issues in our communities. Let's talk about sexconference.com. Be there so you can write about it, and let's shift the narrative and shift the culture on how we talk about bodily autonomy in this country, so that we can stay and pull away, right, all that's happening around what's happening politically, and this being able to be a political wedge issue in our communities.
Can we please thank this wonderful panel of Melanie Campbell, Kristen Clark, Sybrina Fulton, and Monica Simpson. Thank you all.
In first grade, I could sit middle ways of class and could see the board. Junior high, I was on the front row. High school, I was pushing the desk up by the teacher's desk because I could not see what they were putting on the board. It was really hard, but I think it made me a stronger person. Low-income people and senior citizens do experience some of the same problems when it comes to access to quality resources. And technology has left a lot of people left them behind. I learned about Internet Essentials at a meeting put on by the city of Savannah where we were talking about the digital divide. I had never ever thought that I would be able to do that myself. It just took me aback. I now understand all of the things I was missing. My sister, she would come from New York carrying her laptop, but she couldn't use it here. This last visit, I was so proud to say, we got Wi-Fi in the house. And we were just having a ball. We were spending more time together and more quality time together. That in itself has been a wonderful experience. And it's all because of the Internet Essentials. I think this is going to change my life drastically. This is going to be a marvelous time for us. I intend to learn some things.
Please welcome your final moderator for the morning, Kerwin Spade, executive producer at WPIX 11 in New York City.
Good morning. All right, the next conversation, thank you. The next conversation is all about the social impact of technology, specifically the gap known as the digital divide, some of the latest efforts to help close it. Please help me welcome the panel this morning, Joteka Edie. She is the Vice President of Policy, Strategic Engagement, and Impact at Linda, a company helping others become more financially stable. Kai Frazier is the owner of Curated by Kai, and she launched a company that takes students outside of the classroom using virtual reality. Latoya Drake is with the Google News Initiative, helping improve access to more quality journalism. And Karima Zaidan, she's the director of Internet Essentials at Comcast, which helped Ms. Goolsbee get her Wi-Fi. Welcome to you all this morning. Karima, I'll start with you. We usually think about accessing the internet to be children, students who are in school, but as we saw in the last video, it spans generations. Can you talk about that? Who's in the most need?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. I'm going to thank the rest of the panelists here. When we think about the digital divide, I think we take having access to the internet for granted, at least most of us here in this room. We think maybe everybody has access to it and they know how to use it successfully. They know how to navigate the internet. But as it turns out, it's about 23% of households in the country don't have the internet at home, don't subscribe to the internet at home. Not because they don't necessarily have access to the internet, like wireline access built out to their house, which is more of a rural America issue. And those 23%, the 23% of households that don't have access, when you look at the demographics, you will see it is largely low-income communities and people of color. So our initiative here, Internet Essentials, which has been our company's signature community impact initiative for the past 8 years, we are trying to help those houses get connected. And it does span all ages, many different races, but again, primarily people of color concentrated in pockets of poverty in cities, which is, we are an urban company, an urban internet company, so that's primarily who we serve. And the number one reason they're not connected, as it turns out, it's not the price of the internet, it's this bucket of digital literacy issues. So either I don't know how to use the internet, so I don't know if anybody has parents in the room. My mother, certainly 83, using the internet, teaching her how to use an iPad continues to be a challenge and will forever be a challenge. So age is an issue. Seniors really don't. They are at a disadvantage because they didn't grow up in the workforce using this kind of technology. So there are a lot of factors that go into it, but it's really, I don't have the skills, I don't see why it's relevant, how does it help me? It's not the attitude that we bring, which is, it is essential to our everyday existence.
Okay. Joteka, your company, Linda, is not only a payday loan company, but it's helping folks in the tech space. Tell us about that.
So just a bit of a correction.
Thank
so
you.
Linda, we are disrupting the payday lending industry and focus on getting our consumers out of predatory lending products and into more transparent lending products that can create a pathway to financial health. And I think it just goes to the point that when we look at across the country, we have seen, particularly since 2008, we've seen banks just desert from many communities, largely Black and brown communities and poor communities across the country. At the same time, we've seen a rise and an increase of the use of mobile phones, and particularly smartphones. And we are seeing increasingly, if you look at statistics, if the FDIC puts out a statistic and a study every 2 years, but more than 70% of Americans use a smartphone or have access to a smartphone for the use of financial services. And so at Linda, we started our company with the sole focus of using tech advanced underwriting and access to create better access to lending products, but not only thinking about how do we give customers access to quality credit, transparent credit, safe credit, but how do we also use that technology to bring education to our customers and a better user experience using the technology and creating a real impact as we do that as well. So we've been able to save our customers $244 million in fees and interest, in addition to having delivered more than 2.1 financial education classes. So we are able to utilize technology to bring a real impact to customers who otherwise have been really just pushed to the margin and receive some of the most predatory services offered, largely targeted in their communities.
Okay. Kai, we're talking about technology, we're talking about education. Tell us about Curated by Kai. How does that work?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I would say I started my company being a teacher. I've been in education for about 15 years, and what I kept seeing was my students were in an endless cycle of poverty and very few opportunities. Myself, I grew up homeless when I was in high school, so I didn't even know what a college was. I had no aspirations to even go to college, so I know what it feels like to be a student in underserved communities and realizing that no help is coming for you. With that being said, I had no tech background, and like I said, I was a history teacher. So tech was not in the cards for me. But for me, when I saw virtual reality, it was the first life hack where everybody was using it for empathy. By putting a VR headset on, I know what it feels like to be in a refugee camp. I saw it as a life hack for access. I didn't see my college until I stepped foot on my college campus. I went to school in Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, where I got a history degree in the Confederacy. Maybe I wouldn't have picked that school if I would have saw the school beforehand. So for a lot of my students, now they're able to see through VR new jobs in STEM, new colleges and careers, things that maybe teaching history, they crash and burn in my class because they have no concept of the concepts that I'm teaching them in history. What is it to talk about Greece and being separated by bodies of water when you've never left your neighborhood and you don't even know what a body of water looks like? So by using VR, and we're doing mobile VR, so that means all you need is a cell phone pretty much. And my students don't even realize that a cell phone can take them across the globe. So we're making sure that my pet peeve is in tech. A lot of tech companies are wanting you to build the latest and greatest new thing, but nobody's meeting people where they are. So we are making tech that meets people where they are when they don't have Wi-Fi and when they cannot afford the expensive tools to participate in the new tech field.
Latoya, you work for the Google News Initiative. Are companies or newsrooms open to Google coming in and telling them, you should use this, you should be doing that, this could help you do this better?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I've been at Google about 5 years, just over 5 years, so I've seen the mood, the energy, the climate towards Google change in that time. And last year, you mentioned the Google News Initiative. It's an initiative that we launched last year, and what it was meant to do is get very concerted, be very precise and very intentional about how Google works with newsrooms. We are not blind to the challenges that everyone's facing, but it became very clear that we needed to be more intelligent about what we were doing and how we were working with newsrooms. I'll be more specific about what the initiative is after. If you've seen it, what we also announced is that there's a $300 million fund that comes with it, and we realized that you can't just put a dollar amount on the challenge challenges that newsrooms are facing. We want to be very, again, intentional about the specific issues that we're trying to tackle. One is around quality journalism and elevating voices that we don't hear. There's also, you talked a little bit about the digital trainings and the digital divide. When we think about quality journalism, and these are not issues that have arisen since 2016 or over the past few years, but access to good information, understanding misinformation versus disinformation. So there are a lot of resources that we put into newsrooms and into partnerships because we understand that that is also what's impacting your communities and the people who are reading your stories. There's another piece of it around, and the big elephant in the room is sustainability and revenue. Publishers are going out of business. The challenges are immense, they are large. But we think about as a technology company, and that's what people see. You know, when you first think about Google, you maybe see that big search bar. We want to say, no, we understand the challenges. How can we take our technology and things like machine learning and AI and figure out how to help you reach new readers or gain new revenue streams or convert people to paying subscribers? That's the thing that Google can uniquely do. And there's also a big point about trying to, I would say, I guess trying to make sure that we are not kind of speaking in code, if you will, making sure that we're not just talking about the new, wow, biggest thing in technology, but not being cognizant of the fact that it's often hard to implement these things. Google can come in and we can talk about VR, but if we don't have any respect to the fact that small newsrooms maybe don't have the access to the resources, they maybe don't have access to developers, they maybe don't have access to technologists who can come in and help them develop these technologies, then it would be remiss on us to not offer that kind of assistance. So at a very larger level, that's what the initiative is meant to do, really be intentional about understanding the challenges in newsrooms, but then showing up very humbly and showing up very respectfully and listening and doing it in a very collaborative way, because we know that we can't solve these issues on our own. It is not something that Google will come in and say, here's the blueprint, we're here to save journalism, everyone now go. That is not at all the posture, and I don't think that would be met very well at all, but it is very much a collaborative initiative that wants to, at the root, understand what's happening in various newsrooms, big and small, and figuring out how we can come in a very respectful way and offer some assistance in a way to energize energize the industry where it can be most helpful.
Okay, so should the internet be free? I mean, each one of you have talked about what you do, what your organization does, but there is still this piece of I need access, whether it's I need to fill out an application, right? Or I need to see what's happening, or I want to Google something, or I want to buy something. So should the internet be free?
I'll jump in. So I was sharing this with Kerwin before in backstage. A lot of people, they might read about me and they think that I am just this tech executive. I have long been a civil rights advocate and an activist, and still am. I like to think of myself as on assignment in Silicon Valley. Based on just a lens of having worked across the country and across the world, really focused on disadvantaged communities that have been pushed to the margins. When you look at the power of technology and the power of the internet, absolutely yes. We need to develop ways to ensure that we have greater access, because the access, we look at even just like the mobile phone, and what the mobile phone now has allowed for just any individual to do. We can apply for a loan. We can use your mobile phone now to apply for a job. These are all barriers that have, someone may have previously faced, that you now overcome by use of the mobile phone, or even just our ability to be more vocal in terms of our activism. And we look at the Black Lives Movement, largely, or the Women's March, largely started the Women's March. There was a woman who wrote, she powerful words on Facebook, said we should march and rally, close it, came back the next morning, thousands of people said we should march, and there was the birth of the Women's March. Or you look at that powerful yet horrific photo that we saw of Mike Brown on Instagram that really propelled and inspired just a movement of people to stand up and say what we have always been saying, but we had platforms now to amplify Black Lives Matter and everything that we're seeing. So having access to technology, whether it is in our personal day-to-day lives in banking, our ability to advocate, or even our ability to access services such as jobs. The internet is that vital tool, and it should be free, and we should have greater access to it.
So how do we close the gap? I mean, we can close it tactically, right, with Internet Essentials, but then how do we close it strategically, right? What's the bigger story? What's the bigger thing that needs to happen in order to really help close the digital divide?
So I might disagree a little bit, although I think it's a totally fair question and one we should continue to debate around whether or not the internet should be free. When we launched Internet Essentials, there are 3 components to it. Discounted service, so it's $9.95 a month, no credit check, no contract. You can disconnect, reconnect as often as you need it. We offer a discounted device, $150 computer, but then the third component, which answers your question, is we invest, and over the past 8 years it's been $650 million, we invest in nonprofits to provide digital literacy, digital skills training. And I think that is the strategic question. And we did contemplate in 2011 when we launched, should this be free? And there was a lot of research at the time, and I can remember specifically in the book Freakonomics when it came out, that if you offer something for free, it won't necessarily accelerate adoption of technology. You need to invest in nonprofit partners, government, schools, in order to provide the training, the skills, so that people believe, like, yeah, I can see the benefit. Like, this really helps me. You need to have that sense of self-efficacy. So I think, at least for us, that is the way in which we're trying to approach this strategic question. Continue to invest in the digital infrastructure of basically impoverished communities. Training, computer labs, get the training, get people the skills they need so that they can participate as we all do.
I think Google has a very specific answer, and it's a company that is built on the open web and access to information. And we don't succeed as a company if there's not open access and readily available information to people. In terms of closing the digital divide, there are 2 specific programs I think worth reflecting on or mentioning here in this setting. One of the things that we're trying to be intentional about, again, I use that word intentional a lot, is where does the issue start? At what point can we understand what's happening in communities? How do we change people actually thinking that they have access to these careers? We have a program called Code Next, which speaks to K through 12 students. Right now it's in Harlem, it's in Oakland. How do we change the trajectory of someone's life? If you're thinking about who has access to what, who's building code, who's writing algorithms, at what point does someone say to a young person, this is a possibility for you? Who were the teachers that were in your school? Did any engineers come to your school from Google? We actually do these camps where we take kids out of their schools, they're after school, they're on the weekend, and they come to a physical place to work with Google to say to these students, this is a possibility for you. How can we give you access to an opportunity that hopefully changes your life? And then there's another one I'll briefly reflect on, a program called Grow with Google that we launched in the past couple of years. And that essentially allows people to walk off the street into a physical location and learn tools, learn skills, learn anything from, we did a talk earlier this week on Monday about podcasting. No one knows how to do that. How do you get the resources to do it? How do you actually figure out how to get started to do something like that? So yes, we're a big company and we may seem again like a search bar, but we are thinking about how do we get in communities, be very proactive about it, and change the trajectory of someone's life to close that divide. And it takes a lot of work. There are teams built around it, but it's being, within Google, very honest about the fact that there is a role that we have to play to make that possibility aware, especially at a young age, which I think is where that conversation starts. It's one really about pipeline in my mind, and we're trying to get to the heart of that.
Okay. We'll open it up to the floor for questions. Looks like there's one. He's ready. He's running.
Okay, thanks. I'm Wayne Dawkins. I'm an associate professor at Morgan State University. Since I'm an educator, just on this question of the internet, whether it should be free or not, just a reminder to everyone that the internet was a government project that we didn't know about in the 60s, and then it was turned over to the people in the 90s. But to my questions, and it's to the person from Comcast. We're now in 5G technology, which is great for middle class and affluent folk, but is that going to be a problem for that undersized group? Is 3G going to work? Or how we're going to navigate that? Because now we have a new technology that's already, there's concerns that it's problematic for poor urban customers and rural people because it's not the big towers anymore. It's something smaller. So from a cost standpoint and a practical standpoint, how are you going to really get to that 23%?
So thanks for your question. And I don't want to be presumptuous and speak on behalf of other telecommunications companies that like AT&T and Verizon that are offering 5G. We continue to be in the wireline internet and Wi-Fi space. But I think companies that provide internet service, whether it's Comcast, Charter, or Verizon and AT&T, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we are being inclusive in our approach on how we're connecting people, regardless of whether it's wireless or wireline and Wi-Fi. And our approach has been to invest in communities, historically disenfranchised communities with Internet Essentials, to make sure that they can get access wherever Comcast provides service. And I would put it on all companies that provide service to think about their approach to ensuring that everyone continues to have access. It really is, it is the private sector and the public sector and nonprofits working together to solve this. No one company, person, government can do this alone.
Yes, there's another question.
Hi, I'm E.R. Ship, and I actually am a colleague of the previous questioner. I have a question about the Google outreach efforts. How do we get that in Baltimore?
It should already be in Baltimore, so let me take that note back. We are a big company, but there are a small amount of people who do the work and we can't get everywhere. So we actually launched a training program to scale all of the outreach and to go in various cities around the country and certainly around the world. You should be able to actually reach some of our trainers and get them in your newsrooms. I would love to connect with you afterward, but we are meant to, what we try to do is a word that we throw around Google all the time is scale. And again, as I mentioned, we can't do it alone, so we do have a very robust training network that goes around the country. If you want to get tools training, for instance, you want to learn about not just how to use a search engine, but how do you use maps to tell a story, how do you, if you're not a data journalist, how can we teach you how to scrape data and also tell a story? So these resources exist, and you need to make sure they are getting to you.
And also the working with the K through 12s.
Yes.
So I'd like to talk about that.
Absolutely.
So I'll talk to you after.
For sure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so we have a number of journalists in the room, a number of journalists watching. What's the pitch? So we're all going back to work on Monday. What is the pitch? What is the short one sentence, two sentence that we should be taking back to our editorial meetings to say, we need to cover these issues, right? Because it's not just one issue. It's very vast. Each one of you.
I'll start.
Okay.
I might take a different approach to the question. We don't see ourselves as being in a position to tell journalists what to cover or having a point of view or dictating what stories you cover and how you cover them. What we want to be able to do is be there and make sure you have the resources that you need, be that through a partnership, learning how to use tools, so on and so forth. But I think it would be very reckless of Google to go into newsrooms and dictate coverage, and we want to stay away from that. Journalists have a hard job to do, and it's a very specific job, and we have mad respect for it, but we want to make sure we're not crossing the lines as Google trying to dictate journalism.
Okay. Anybody
else? I'll jump in with some suggestions, and this is, I know we've had a large portion of this conversation is about access to technology, but I think there is a deeper conversation. We have benefited. I am a Black woman in the C-suite of a company in Silicon Valley. There are far too few of us. There are far too few funded Black and brown founders. There are far too few Black asset managers and VCs. So I think that there is a great need to tell the story of Black and brown founders. Both equally as important is there to tell the story of the need for more diversity. There's also importance to tell the story of the successes, the stories of founders that have been successful, of the companies that they're building, the impact that they're making. When I transitioned into tech, I was the senior advisor to the president of NAACP for 7 years. I had accomplished a lot. I talk about this very publicly, but I dealt with impostor syndrome, which is this thought that you can't be successful or you don't belong. And I had helped win a Supreme Court case, had overturned a state constitution on voting rights, had done all this work, but did not see a reflection of myself in Silicon Valley as a Black woman. And I think that there is an opportunity and a responsibility to really share more of those stories, of those success stories, because I think it's important for the young people that Kai are working with and in K through 12, or even just adults, to see that there is a rightful place for you in the industry. There's this misconception that you need to know how to code and have a technical background to be successful in Silicon Valley. That is not the case at all. There are numerous non-technical positions, whether you are in marketing, business, or whether or not you are in legal. There are opportunities for you to be successful, and then opportunities for you to be at the leadership table in those companies. So I would really press upon not just talking about the problem, but also some of the solutions and some of the successes.
I want to jump in there. So as a Black woman in Silicon Valley, I feel like I'm in the belly of the beast every single day, and I depend on journalists to give me that line of defense and to educate me. But I don't see a lot of that or strong sources to go to when it comes to the things that I need to not be devoured by Silicon Valley. So the stories I usually see are unicorn stories, right? This founder raised X amount of money. People to watch out for in tech. Is blank the new Silicon Valley? But I don't get the stories that are talking about the IPOs, the exits, stories about why are Black founders being ousted from their companies when they take VC money? What is it like to fundraise while being a Black woman? Black women get 0.2% of VC funding. That's basically 0%. Yet Black entrepreneurs, Black women entrepreneurs are the fastest growing class of entrepreneurs. So how is everybody else surviving? We don't hear those stories. Even things I want to really state, I got an email this morning about, hey, this is a great program at this company for diversity. I need stories on the exploitative diversity initiatives that are happening that are taking our IP away from us, our intellectual property, by doing these programs. We need to call them out, and we're not seeing that. So when I talk to other founders out in the Bay, I'm seeing people who don't even know the basics about startup life, and they're not going to do well because we don't have those sources. So I just want to plug or put a shout out to, I make my team every single day read Sherelle Dorsey's The Plug Daily. It's the only place where I can send them to get consistent investigative journalism every single day. And we need those insights if we are going to survive and make a dent in tech.
I would just close it out here, and also just want to acknowledge we do have someone else, looks like, wanting to ask a question. Okay. But we were here in Miami a couple of days ago to announce that we have expanded the program to serve all low-income households in our footprint. Anyone who's eligible for more than a dozen public assistance programs can apply for the service. And we've connected 8 million people and 2 million households over the past 8 years. And whether you're talking about Comcast and our efforts or other providers in this space, to just write about this issue. Connectivity matters. And if you as journalists can include this as part of the story, that when you have access, well, people will be able to read your stories online, but they'll be able to do all the things from banking to applying for jobs to all the things we've discussed here. They'll be able to do those things that we take for granted every day.
Question.
Good morning there, Kerwin. It's Brett Chambers from the Triangle Association of Black Journalists and also North Carolina Central University. I'd like to, thank the ladies for being up there and sharing your stories with us. I just met Kai out at Tech Trek for NABJ, so good to see you. And LaToya was at North Carolina Central sharing her Google tools. And I want to say that my students have benefited from that visit because I've integrated some of the Google tools with them. And the question and comment I have, it's great to talk about the technology, but how are they going to use it? And that's one of the things that when I started integrating both some of the things I learned from LaToya and from Kai, they kind of they have that baffled look, confused look, because even though they're digital natives, they still don't make the connection between the technology and what they do every day. And it's really hard to make that connection. And the fact that I make them, have them create a business inside of the classroom, they still don't make the connection between how to use the tools and what they're building. And if you have a suggestion, I'd be willing to hear it. Plus, I'd like to have you come to North Carolina Central and share that answer.
And I remember this. This was with Nicole Hannah-Jones and the Ida B. Wells Society.
Exactly, in
like
the law
2 years
school.
ago.
Yes.
You look familiar when you got up. So what he's speaking about is a few years ago when Nicole launched the Ida B. Wells Society, we came on board to support her and go and talk about investigative journalism at HBCUs, and we went to various places. How do you take that into something that you use in your daily life? This is one that when we leave, realistically, I don't have the expectation that people have a light bulb moment and say, all right, now I know how to do this. The applications comes from seeing it in somebody's life. So what you'll see Google do quite often is try to take these stories and put them in a narrative form so that it's very tangible. So that, and this kind of touched on in the video earlier, there was an example of a woman in Harlem who wanted to start a hat business, and she wanted to sell her hats. But she didn't necessarily know how to do that online. How do you actually get on Google Maps? How do you then reach users? How do you then manage your inventory? How do you use the Google suite of products in a way that might not be something that's academic to you, but helps you make money? And I think people need to see more of those examples so that when I go into a newsroom, when I go to a university, it's very tactical as here's how you do this. But I think those applications come from seeing someone like you or someone familiar to you, use them and turn them into a business or something that they can monetize would be one way that I would suggest as a way to figure out how this makes sense to your life and not just how it makes sense to your curriculum or your schooling or your training per se.
Was there another question, Brett?
Just a follow-up, and it's a thank you to both, again, to Kai and Latoya. There's a whole new thing outside that's very much running in parallel with journalism called digital humanities. And we've been using the tools from Google and starting to work on the extended reality stuff, Kai. So just wanted to say thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that is the time that we have for this morning. So I definitely want to thank our panelists, Jateka, Kai, Latoya, and Karima. It's been very insightful. This is a very vast conversation, but thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Please join us this afternoon back here in the King Ballroom for the 2020 Presidential Candidates Forum. Hear from Democratic Senators Bernie Sanders and Cory Booker, South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and Republican candidate Bill Weld. That's at 4:30 p.m. here in the King Ballroom.